All right, hi everyone. We're about to get started. If you want to grab a seat real quick. Welcome everyone to today's program, the greatest mass of mason work, building and illustrating the Rochester Aqueduct. Does our resident technician, Brandon Fess, have any idea as to why we're getting feedback? That wasn't feedback? That was an alarm. Great. Okay. I'm Emily Mori. I'm a historical researcher here in the Local History and Genealogy Division, which is presenting today's program. Just a couple housekeeping notes before we begin. The restrooms are located just to the left of here, so just make a left turn when you leave the auditorium. Also wanted to let you know that we have a lot of great programs coming up in the next couple months presented by the Local History and Genealogy Division. I've left a few flyers out on the table in case anyone is interested. And I'll just give a quick plug to the two programs we have coming up next. On October 25th in in Cussler Cox Auditorium from 1 to 2:30 p.m. we're going to have a multi-generational panel about the local Italian-American community, moderated by RIT Professor Michael Brown. And then on November 1st, back in this auditorium from 1 to 2:30 p.m., we are going to have a very special program. An author by the name of Cynthia Neal, who wrote a book on Queen Catherine Montour, who is a Haudenosaunee heroine and the namesake of Montour Falls, New York, will be here to discuss the book, that historical novel she wrote, which ended up finding its way into the hands of one of Queen Catherine Montour's only living descendants, who lives in the Six Nations Reservation in Ontario, Canada. So both of them will be here to discuss the life and legacy of Catherine Montour. But on to today's very exciting program. We're joined here today by Steve Boerner. Mr. Boerner spent most of his career in journalism. He worked for the Democrat and Chronicle from 1984 until 2006 as a photographer and editor. Following his stint with the DNC, or his rather long stint, he started his own freelance graphic design business. He provided products for the University of Rochester, among many other clients. And then since his semi-retirement, quasi-retirement in 2020, he has been devoting much of his attention to researching and illustrating the early Erie Canal and its construction process. And this work is documented on his website, 40by4by28.com. And today he's here to discuss his fascinating work, after which we will have a question and answer session. So without further ado, please help me welcome Mr. Steve Boerner.
Okay, can you hear me? I'm not used to working with a microphone, so let me know if I underproject or overproject. Is that better? Do I need to flip a switch or no? Yeah. Thank you. How's that? Any better? Okay. I'll try to lean forward. So anyway, I'd like to say hi to everybody and thanks for joining us here today to talk about the Erie Canal and the first aqueduct over the Genesee River. I'd like to thank the Rochester Public Library for hosting this event and giving me the chance to talk to all of you. And also I'd like to thank the libraries and archives that I visited to conduct research on this topic, including this one, which has an excellent history department, the Rochester Historical Society, the New York State Library, and others. I'd especially like to thank the New York State Archives for underwriting part of my research in the form of a Hackman Research Residency grant, which paid for several trips to Albany to do research there. I'd also like to mention that I'm a member of the Canal Society of New York State. I'd like to give it a quick plug. We're always happy to sign up new members. So if you are interested in canal history or canal preservation, please give us a look. There's a website, And we also publish a magazine twice a year. I put some copies on the back table there. Feel free to take one, but if it's down to the last copy, I'd like to ask you please to leave it so everyone can have a look. And back to the talk. If you were to walk one block east of here and look under the Broad Street Bridge, you would see an Erie Canal aqueduct. It was built from 1836 to 1842 as part of the first enlargement of the Erie Canal. This is not the aqueduct we're looking for. The aqueduct we'll be talking about today was built from 1821 to 1823 as part of the first canal, otherwise known as Clinton's Ditch. In its day, that aqueduct was considered a masterpiece of design and construction. As it neared completion, the New York State Canal Commission proudly described it as, quote, the greatest mass of mason work contained in any one structure on the canal. Not long before, however, things did not look so bright. When David Bates, the resident engineer on this section of the Erie Canal, arrived in Rochester in March 1822, the view that greeted him must have been disheartening. The great work of spanning the Genesee River with an 800-foot-long aqueduct had commenced the previous summer. But instead of a partly constructed stone waterway, what he found instead were the remains of a disaster. Workers had spent the summer and fall quarrying stone blocks and transporting them to the worksite. Then they built the first pier for the aqueduct, anchoring it firmly to the stony bed of the river with cramps and iron bolts. But that December, William Britton, the contractor, unexpectedly died. Then the Genesee River flooded, as it often did in those days. The freshet carried off the newly built pier. All that was left were the big iron bolts poking out of the riverbed, completely bent over by the force of the current. To add insult to injury, all the stone blocks and tools that Britton had collected were confiscated by the county sheriff. Britton was heavily in debt when he died. In those days, debts were often settled by the seizure and sale of the person's property. Everything went under the hammer and was sold to two men named Hart and Saxton, who operated a general store down at the Four Corners. Conceiving the property to be indispensable, Bates later wrote, I repurchased the same of Hart for rebuilding the aqueduct. So here is the receipt from the sale. Bates paid $377.61 for property that by right already belonged to the state. So David Bates recovered his stone and tools, and he had a contractor because a new one had been signed only days after Britton's death. But he still didn't have an aqueduct. He'd be starting almost from scratch. The construction season had been wasted. Before we finish the story of the aqueduct, I'd like to step back a few years. How was it that an aqueduct was being built in Rochester in the first place? And why was there even a village here at this spot on the Genesee River? Let's have another look at the river as it appears today. This picture was taken near the east end of the Broad Street Bridge, just a few hundred feet from here, looking west. This is the Aqueduct building. Now it's the home office of Constellation Brands, First Federal Plaza, and of course the Main Street Bridge. But if we were to step back in time to the year 1810, the same view would have looked something like this. The river in the foreground is occupied by a rocky shelf belonging to the Upper Falls. This feature was a series of shelves and rapids that extended from the today's Court Street Dam to Broad Street. They were not as impressive as the High Falls, which in those days were about 96 feet high. The Upper Falls totaled only 16 feet. But this was enough to eventually power a large complex of water-powered industries: flour mills, sawmills, oil mills, trip hammers, and other factories. Even though they are no longer here, the Upper Falls are the most important reason why Rochester is where it is today. And real quickly, I'd like to point out a second feature. If you look carefully, there's a stony shelf about 16 feet high on the opposite side of the river. This feature is still there. It's beneath all of the foundations and streets of downtown Rochester today. But if you're walking, for example, south on Fitzhugh Street, you'll be climbing this shelf of rock. And it's important because there was a matching shelf of rock on the east side that was abutted the bank of the river. And when the canal engineers came through, they decided to build the canal on top of those rocky shelves, because by doing so, they could keep the same level all the way from Rochester to Lockport, which was 60 miles away. It's called the Long Level. So this was a natural abutment, as it were, for the west end of the aqueduct. This is a picture, this is actually a hand-drawn map that Nathaniel Rochester made of the 100-acre tract when he was surveying and selling lots, 1811, 1812. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of the 100-acre tract. This was a parcel right next to the Upper Falls that was purchased in 1811 by Rochester, William Fitzhugh, and Charles Carroll, all Southerners from the state of Maryland. They had recognized the site's industrial potential. Settlers were trickling into western New York, and a new road and a bridge over the river were being built. Lot sales were slow at first, but with the conclusion of the War of 1812, things picked up. The bridge was finished, new flour mills were erected, and the village of Rochesterville began to take shape. The earliest impression that we have of Rochesterville was sketched by a visiting Frenchman in 1816. He was standing near Four Corners in present-day downtown Rochester looking southwest. This road right here would become Buffalo Street and later West Main Street. This area here today is occupied by the Blue Cross Arena. The large frame building here is probably the old Red Mill, which was built in 1814 by two brothers, Elijah and Hervey Ely, and Josiah Bissell Jr., all recently arrived from Massachusetts. Now, the mill built by the Ely brothers and their partner was not the quaint sort of grist mill that you might picture in your mind when you think about flour mills. It was an industrial scale processing plant, 4 or 5 stories tall, and enclosing a sophisticated arrangement of machinery to clean, sort, and pack flour into barrels, ready for shipment. The entire operation could be run by 2 men. It was the first automated assembly line. The intention was to process grain into flour, not only for the local market, but for export. The Elys had big dreams, and they fully intended to make their fortune in the flour milling business. But the Elys' monopoly on the flour milling industry at the Upper Falls would not last long. In 1817, yet another Yankee, a surveyor by the name of Elijah Johnson, arrived on the scene. When Johnson learned that Eno Stone's 80-acre farm on the east bank of the Genesee River was for sale, he bought it for $10,000 and laid out his own village to rival Rochesterville on the other side of the river. Much of our street grid east of the river was designed by Johnson, who included a public square that became today's Washington Square Park. Johnson then used black powder to blast out a mill race. That's this channel right here. It went all along the river from the top of the Upper Falls and all the way down north to Main Street. He built a mill dam, you can see part of that here, across the Genesee River above the Upper Falls, and made a deal with Nathaniel Rochester to divide the water in the river 50-50. Half the water would go into the Rochester Raceway on the west side, and half the water would go into the Johnson Raceway on the east side. So here's how things stood around 1820. On this map, north is to the left. I'm sorry, north is to the right. So the Genesee River is flowing north in this direction. On the west bank, we have a couple of sawmills, and then there's the old Red Mill again. On the east bank, we have sawmills. I believe this is a cloth mill, a paper mill, and then the yellow mill, which was built in 1817, which was another flour mill. The grain that fed these mills was grown in the rich soil of the Genesee River Valley many miles to the south. It was harvested and threshed by hand and then carried by boat down the river to the upper falls. We know the owners of these mills had invested large sums to construct and operate them. They were determined to sell their product to outside markets. But how would it be delivered? At the time, water transportation was much more efficient than road transportation. But the only water route available to the mill owners of the Genesee Falls was by ship across Lake Ontario to Montreal and then on to Europe. The risks were great. Storms and ice could delay or stop shipment across the lake. It could take months for a shipment to reach its destination. And in the meantime, price fluctuations could make the original investment worthless. But soon, everything would change. Plans were being made for a canal from the Hudson River to Lake Erie. For one thing, the war with Great Britain had demonstrated the importance of good transportation from the eastern seaboard to the Great Lakes. For another, Western New York was quickly filling up with settlers who needed a dependable way to move their products east. In 1816, it seemed the plans would become a reality. Money was allocated by the state to survey a route from Albany to Buffalo. The surveyors wasted no time. I think the law was passed in April, and they were in the field the following month. And they were soon approaching Rochester from the west. On July 30th, Hervey Ely jotted a quick note to the end of a letter he was sending to Nathaniel Rochester. P.S., he wrote, "The surveyors for the Great Canal are now here. They crossed the river yesterday, about 100 yards above the head of the race." So what would the new canal mean for Rochester and the milling industry there? Let's take another look at the route that had been used up to this time. There's one additional obvious fact that I didn't mention before. That is, the waterborne route across Lake Ontario sent their exports not to the east coast of the United States, but to the British Empire and Europe. Any economic benefit to the trade of this country was done once the flour was sold. On the other hand, once the canal was completed, it would provide a safe, dependable, and inexpensive way, emphasis on inexpensive, to ship their finished product to markets not in Canada, but directly to New York City and the east coast of the United States. And the transit time would now be measured in days instead of months. But it gets even better, because the canal would extend west to Buffalo, a port on Lake Erie that would open up the entire Great Lakes Basin to passenger and commercial traffic. Now the flour millers of Rochester could source their grain not just from the Genesee Valley, but from the Ohio Valley and even points even further west. The Erie Canal would make the village of Rochester an important crossroads instead of a remote outpost in the wilderness. The survey team that had crossed the Genesee River on July 30 was led by an engineer named James Geddes, who would later become an important figure in the construction of the Erie Canal. This is a detail of a map that he drew based on that 1816 survey. The line of the canal crosses the river. The canal is the green line. Here's Rochesterville. So the canal is crossing the Genesee River south of the village, right about where the Susan B. Anthony Bridge is now. You'll notice that there's no sign of an aqueduct. Instead, Geddes was proposing that they build a 10-foot high dam here to create a slackwater crossing. So what's a slackwater crossing? Basically, back in those days, canal engineers had two ways to cross a stream that got in the way of the canal. They could build it with a slackwater crossing, which was to build a dam across the river, or stream, whatever it was, to create a pool of still or slack water. Then the canal was directly connected to that pool, and a towpath bridge was built across it so that animal teams could pull the boats across. It was pretty inexpensive, but slackwater crossings could be risky, especially with a river like the Genesee, which fluctuated dramatically over the course of the year. During the dry seasons, the water level could drop, stranding canal boats. In the spring and fall, floods could back up into the canal and damage it. The second way to cross stream was to build an aqueduct or water bridge. This carried the canal's water channel over the river. Aqueducts could be built of stone or of a combination of stone and wood. Either way, they were more expensive than a slackwater crossing, but much more safe and dependable. The question was, which would be the best way to cross the Genesee River? As we've seen, the Genesee River could be very destructive when it flooded, and it did so with alarming regularity, sometimes twice a year. In 1817, the annual freshet, as it was then called, swept away 2 buildings and undermined the foundation of the Buffalo Street Bridge. Another flood in 1819 backed up into the mill race on the west bank and caused considerable damage. So when Erie Canal engineer Canvas White visited Rochester in the spring of 1819, he would have seen the results of the most recent flood. White had instructions to find the best way to cross the Genesee River, and seeing the flood damage would have certainly made him think twice about using a slackwater crossing. But then he noticed the rocky bed of the Genesee River below the upper falls and realized that it would make a perfect foundation for a large stone structure, an aqueduct. So he thought about building an aqueduct here. So there was something else that he noticed, not only the rocky bed of the river, but something else that pointed directly to the location where he wanted to build the aqueduct. And that thing was Elijah Johnson's raceway. The raceway was in the right place, and it was the right size. It was 40 feet wide and 4 feet deep, the same size as the Erie Canal. I'm sure that Canvas White could hardly believe his good fortune. Johnson had already done the hard work of blasting the channel to the new aqueduct that he wanted to build. State law gave the canal commissioners almost unlimited power to appropriate private property as they saw fit in order to complete the canal. They took Johnson's raceway and compensated him by building a new one in the bed of the river, right where it is today. In October 1819, the canal commissioners met in Utica and made the decision to build an aqueduct across the Genesee River. The first contract for construction of the aqueduct was signed on June 6, 1821. The contractors were Samuel Horn, William Patrick, and Abraham Camp. The contract specified that they were to, quote, grub, clear, excavate, embank, construct, and complete all that part of the line of the Erie Canal between the east and west banks of the river, including the construction of the said aqueduct and a culvert near the east end thereof. Everything was to be completed by August 1st, 1822, just a little over a year away. But Samuel Horn and his partners did not hold the contract for very long. They soon sold it to a newcomer by the name of William Britton. William Britton was best known as the builder of the new state prison at Auburn. There he built a block of cells for solitary confinement that would be widely copied and is still used in penitentiaries today. Besides supervising construction of the prison, he was also appointed its first keeper, or what we would today call the prison warden. This is what may have tempted him to take the contract for the Rochester Aqueduct. He had at his disposal a reliable source of free labor. Britton would take advantage of a law that allowed private individuals to put convicts to work on the Erie Canal. He would be required to post a $10,000 bond, which was an awful lot of money in those days, and to pay for transportation, shelter, food, and security for all the prisoners that he took to the work site. So immediately took a huge investment on his part to get this up and running. In early August 1821, he selected a group of 50 convicts and loaded the first 25 onto wagons for the trip to Rochester. The average age of the group was 28 years old. The youngest was 17-year-old Henry Christie once, who was completing the 3rd year of a life sentence for burglary. So think about that. He would have been sentenced to life for burglary at the age of 14. The oldest was Jacob Teeples, a 57-year-old who was serving an 8-year sentence for perjury. Most of them had committed nonviolent crimes such as perjury, counterfeiting, and grand larceny. but one, Samuel Davy of Otsego, New York, was serving a 5-year term for assault and battery. They were to be set to work at the most thankless, dangerous jobs involved in building the aqueduct, hewing stone in the quarries and using black powder to blast away the obstructions in the Genesee River. Things didn't work out quite as planned. Even though the prisoners were supposed to be under constant guard, they took advantage of every opportunity to escape. I mean, seriously, wouldn't you? Rochester is surrounded by woods at that time. It's not very developed in the countryside. Once they got out of town, they were, open road to Pennsylvania, wherever else they were going. Newspaper editors had a field day. By the end of the year, many, if not most, of the 50 convicts working on the aqueduct were long gone, and not many were recaptured. In mid-December, after a sudden illness of a few days, William Britton died. He left behind a wife and 10 children, the youngest of which was only 3 years old. He also left behind a partially built aqueduct, which, as we know, was soon washed away by the Genesee River. So we finally come full circle, and we're back to where we started this story. The Rochester Aqueduct was a high-priority project. In late 1821, the canal commissioners may have been worried that it would become the bottleneck that would delay the opening of the canal, and now they were a year behind schedule. They wasted no time. On Christmas Day, 1821, almost before poor William Britton's body was cold, they signed a new agreement with a group of contractors led by Seymour Scoville, Alfred Hovey, and Abel Wethy. The new contractors spent that winter searching for a good local source of durable stone. They found this durable stone, or so they thought, below the lower falls in the Genesee River Gorge, where a layer of red Medina sandstone lay about 14 feet below the surface. This is a current satellite image of Rochester. North is to the left. Here's the River Gorge, downtown Rochester, with what's left of the inner loop. The sandstone quarry would have been in this general area. Quarrying the sandstone was hard and expensive work. First, they had to clear the overlying earth. Then they had to use blasting powder and picks, hammers, and crowbars to split the rock into large red blocks. After being cut from the quarry, the blocks, which weighed between 1 and 2 tons apiece, had to be delivered to the work site, about 3.5 miles upstream. But first, the blocks had to be lifted from the bottom of the gorge to the top, a vertical ascent of about 200 feet. How did they do this? I'm going to go out on a limb here because this is just a theory, but here is one way they may have been able to lift the stones out of the gorge. A few years earlier, a pair of slides had been built at Hanford's Landing, which was where the wharf was when the people wanted to ship flour and other goods across Lake Ontario. It was a lake-level wharf below the lower falls. The 2 slides carried 2 large cars built on an endless chain system. So when one went up, the other one went down. It was used to haul heavy goods up and down from the top of the gorge to the wharf below. This contraption was probably substantial enough to carry the stones, provided they could be transported from the quarry to the wharf. This would have been simple enough. The stones could have been rafted downstream, or if the river was frozen, they may have been transported by sled over the ice. Once they were delivered to the wharf, the stones would have been placed on the slides and lifted to the warehouse at the top. And from there, they would have been hauled by ox-drawn sled to the aqueduct site. There were other quarries west of the river, and the stone for the aqueduct's coping and water table was brought in from Cayuga County, about 60 miles to the east. But most of the stone used to build the aqueduct came from this red Medina sandstone quarry. We know they used sleds to transport the stones because we have at least one receipt. In 1822, a man named John Hayes billed the Canal Commission $300 for 100 days on the Genesee Aqueduct, 100 days work, and another $200 for the use of his oxen, a sled, and a driver. In all, 13,500 cubic yards of rock would be used to build the aqueduct. That's enough to fill a football field with a stack of stones about as tall as Josh Allen. How did they build the aqueduct? The methods they used would have hardly changed for centuries. After the rough-cut blocks arrived at the work site, they were trimmed and dressed by skilled masons. Then the heavy blocks were transported up to 400 feet out over the riverbed and delicately lowered into place. Tolerances were measured in fractions of an inch. Aside from the animal team used to haul the stones to the site, the work was powered entirely by human effort. These drawings were made in the 1830s to show how masonry bridges were built. Since a stone aqueduct is basically a masonry bridge, it would have been constructed in much the same way. The abutments and piers, there's the abutment, there's the first pier, were built first, and then a wooden roadway called a service road was built across the tops of the piers. Small wagons that ran along the service road, there's one, it's kind of hard to see, yes, there's one there, were used to transport the stone blocks. Next, an arched frame called a center was constructed between the piers, also called false work. These supported the arches while they were being built. The stones were hoisted by winches that rested on a wooden scaffold above the arch. There's two sets here. They worked both sides of the arch at the same time so the weight would be balanced on the center. After raising the blocks, the winches were pushed across the scaffold so the stones could be lowered into place. Again, it's all done by people power. Once the arches were finished, the connecting walls were built. The interior space was then filled with rubble. The masons on the aqueduct worked quickly, setting the abutments and piers firmly into the rocky bed. They tried to attach them a little more firmly this time. They actually excavated the footings down 6 inches into the riverbed. So they anchored those and they erected the 9 main arches, each of which took only a few days to complete. By the end of 1822, all the arches and the walls between them were finished. Incredibly, the aqueduct was completed within 15 months. It opened in October 1823, and even though the entire canal from Albany to Buffalo would not be finished until 2 years later, the new aqueduct allowed canal traffic to go back and forth from Albany to Lockport. Rochester became the country's first boom town. More mills were built, and it became known as the Flower City. It began a growth spurt that would continue through the middle of the 20th century. A few years ago, I decided to try to create an illustration that would show the construction of the aqueduct, to use 3D modeling and landscaping software to make a picture of how it might have looked. It turned out to be quite a learning experience. I couldn't find a complete secondary account of the construction of the first aqueduct. So instead, I turned to primary sources and documents and spent the better part of 2 years doing research and searching for contemporary visual references. It started with the Genesee River. The earliest accurate surveys that I was able to find were done in 1866 in the aftermath of the 1865 flood. A committee investigating the flood produced this map, which shows their best guess as to the shape of the river in 1820. They also measured the elevation of the riverbed from the Court Street Bridge to the Andrews Street Bridge. This was all great information that could be used to model the landscape in the vicinity of the aqueduct. The next step was to try to recreate the village of Rochester. Many individual models would be needed. Whenever possible, I tried to base these on historical records. This digital model of the Red Mill is based on contemporary drawings. A model of the first Monroe County Courthouse is based on actually incredibly detailed and accurate drawing that was made in 1827. A contract drawn up by Nathaniel Rochester included plans and a description of 2 houses that he wanted built, and these could be turned into digital models. But for the aqueduct, unfortunately, no contemporary drawings or plans have survived. We know they had them because they were referred to in the contracts. We don't know where they are now. We have plans from the 1830s that were made for the second aqueduct. Here's the new aqueduct, which is now underneath the Broad Street Bridge, and here's the old aqueduct. So these show us the two aqueducts together and provide an exact location for the first one, along with its overall dimensions. The first aqueduct was designed by engineer Benjamin Wright. When the Erie Canal was finished, he went to work on other projects. One of them was the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which was built along the Potomac River in Maryland. And for that canal, he designed a stone aqueduct across Monocacy Creek. This aqueduct survives to this day and has been carefully documented. The dimensions of the Monocacy Aqueduct are somewhat different from those of the first Rochester Aqueduct, but they're close enough. And so it can show us how the Rochester Aqueduct would have been designed and built. This is a test rendering of my model of the finished aqueduct. Since I wanted to show it while it was under construction, this had to be partly disassembled before it was put into the scene. Finally, many human figures were going to be needed. Building, posing, and shading 3D models of people is a painstaking process. So this took more time than anything else. To make the landscape, I started with a digitally sculpted terrain map of the Upper Falls area. Here is another test rendering. I know it doesn't look like much, but it was a start. It looks much better once you add water and foliage. And here is the same scene with the addition of the village. Among other things, it shows the bread mill, the original red mill, and the new red mill, which was built in 1822. There are some other historically based buildings here. I was talking to Emily before we started, and I was telling her how for a lot of the houses, I didn't have good source materials, so I went to period construction diagrams of similar New England homes and used those. Most of the residents of early Rochester came from the New England area. So now we can add the aqueduct, reaching over 800 feet all the way to that rocky bank on the other side, and the date is late October 1822. Most of the arches are either built or in the process of being built. And here's the finished landscape. The machines are based on the drawings that I showed you earlier. Hand-cranked cranes lower stone blocks onto carts that are then pushed across the service road to the scaffold, where they're then lifted up by these winches and put into place. David Bates, the supervising engineer, wrote that it took 4 3/4 days to build the first arch. Each arch contained about 450 stones. If the workday, were 12 hours long, that would mean the masons building the arch were placing a new stone every 7 or 8 minutes. They were working very quickly. Which takes us to the final chapter. What happened to Rochester's first aqueduct? It was built very quickly by contractors who had no experience in building large masonry structures. Chances are its construction was less than perfect. But there were other problems. Integrating Johnson's north-south raceway into the east-west orientation of the canal produced a 90-degree turn at the east end of the aqueduct. This would back up traffic and prove hazardous for large boats. Next, the aqueduct was only 17 feet wide. Canal boats were 14.5 feet wide. All canal traffic across the river would be one way. And so you can imagine, the canal was, when it first opened, it was bumper to bumper traffic and all kinds of different boats. Imagine those being backed up and waiting for, some slow raft of timber to come across in the opposite direction. So it was a real bottleneck, and it caused endless fistfights among canal boat crews. And finally, and this is the most serious problem of all, it leaked. Possibly because of poor construction, but mainly because of the porous sandstone that they used to build it, the aqueduct began to crumble almost as soon as it was finished. After only 10 years of service, engineers began to draw up contingency plans in case the aqueduct failed completely. When the canal was enlarged, beginning in the 1830s, they realized they would get a second chance, and this time they would do it right. This picture, published in 1855, shows the remains of the old aqueduct in the foreground, with the new one in the background. The first attempt was a failure, but there's no reason to be too hard on the people who built it. When it was finished, they sincerely believed they had defied expectations and built a beautiful, enduring aqueduct. At the time, no one in this country had ever attempted to build anything like it. They learned on the job. And when the problems did appear, the same engineers were able to overcome them and build an even more spectacular permanent structure. The foundation of today's Broad Street Bridge remains one of the largest and most imposing artifacts of our state's 19th century canal system. The first generation of Erie Canal engineers, who learned everything by doing, would not have been able to build it without experiencing the challenges and failures of the first aqueduct. It is a testament to professional engineering, quality workmanship, and the tough limestone of which it is made. Any questions? Yes.
When they carried those lots of stones supposedly on their sleds down the river, how thick was the ice? I mean, I'm assuming the river always goes over in winter.
The question is, I've been asked to repeat the questions for the recording, just so you know. The question is, how thick was the ice in the Genesee River in the wintertime? And that's pure conjecture on my part. I don't know what the conditions were like then in the wintertime. Assuming that it would be thick enough to carry a stone on a sled across the river, but that might just be an assumption on my part. Like I was saying, that whole series of transporting the stone to the slides and up to the gorge is pure conjecture on my part. The slides were there. That's been documented. I know they were there. And the fact that they were downstream from the quarry leads me to believe that that would be the simplest way for them to transport the stone blocks up. There were roads. There was, I think there was a road where Seth Green Drive is today that led up from where the quarry was to the edge of the gorge. I don't know if it's the same road or if the old maps kind of show a switchback road there. Maybe they came up that way. There was also a road from the wharf at Hanford's Landing up to the lip. So maybe they still transported them downriver to the wharf, but then put them on the sleds and hauled them to the top instead of using the slides. But to me, it makes more sense for them to go downstream to get the blocks to the top than to try to go south, which is upstream, because then you've got 200 feet worth of waterfalls that you somehow have to surmount. I just don't see how they could have done it. So. Yes, sir. Right. Right. Oh my gosh. Okay. The comment is that the gentleman here says that back in the day, before it's the Riverside Convention Center now, before they demolished that strip of buildings there to build a convention center, he was led into the basement of one of the buildings and got to see the foundation or the water table, maybe? Wow, that's amazing, of the original aqueduct. That's right, yep. 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 I haven't. I'd love to be. Okay. Right. It's a service driveway now. Yep. Yep. Okay. It's still down there. Okay. Right. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Yep. Mm-hmm. Okay. That's right. Yep. Mm-hmm. Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't that be great? So, yes, sir. It's built on top of the old Johnson Raceway, the old library building. The raceway wasn't part of the canal, but it was moved to that position because the canal came through. So they took his original raceway, and they built a new one for him out into the bed of the river. Basically, they just built a stone wall alongside the riverbank, that paralleled the Erie Canal, and that became the Johnson Raceway. And that's the one that's under the library building. Yep. So I believe it's used for cooling in the summertime. Is that right? Yeah. So the Johnson Raceway is still getting used. It's pretty cool. So, yes, sir.
Yeah, I heard at some point the Genesee River was lowered about 10 feet.
Yes.
During construction or something like, when was that?
Okay, the question is that the Genesee River was lowered at some point by about 10 feet. The actual amount that it was lowered, it depends on who you talk to and what sources you find, but it was because of all the flooding. And they realized in the mid-19th century that the flooding was only going to get worse the more development took place upstream in the Genesee River Valley. As fields were cleared and more construction, there was more open space, more runoff. The floods just kept getting worse and worse and worse. So it was first proposed in the 1860s that they blast the channel of the Genesee River to make it deeper. And the city council, being like city councils everywhere, dithered for about 50 years. But they finally got around to it. I think it was possibly right before World War I, don't quote me, it was like the 19 teens. And they dynamited and brought in steam shovels and all kinds of other tools and machines to excavate the bed of the river. So I think they started about maybe at 2 feet deep at the Court Street Bridge, and by the time they got to the upper falls, they shortened it by, tell me if I'm wrong here, Emily, 12 feet, something like that. It went from 96 feet high to 84, 16 feet, okay. So yeah, so the river we have downtown is really man-made at this point. It bears no resemblance to the first river that was here when the settlers came. And I mentioned the upper falls. Those, when the water level is low and you're walking across the Court Street Bridge, you can just see the remnants of it. Those were blasted out of existence a long time ago, and what they didn't blast has been covered up by the Court Street Dam. So the hand of man has not been very kind to the Genesee River at this part, but they really had no choice because the flooding was terrible. So. Oh gosh, that's a great question. I'm thinking that if there is one, it might be along South Ave, because I think there's still remnants of there was a feeder canal that went down to where the University of Rochester is. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the question. Are there any signs, depressions, or anything of canal basins or the canal in Rochester. I know part of the stone wall of the old feeder is still visible along, I can't remember the name of the road that leads into the University of Rochester along the river there. Wilson Boulevard, that's right. And the mouth of the feeder is still visible. Couldn't figure out what that thing was for years until I finally realized that was the start of a feeder canal. But yeah, you know, I bet if you looked carefully, you could probably see some depressions because there's enough open space there and enough empty lots, I think, along there. Yep. Yep. It's a parking lot now. Yep. 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 Oh, right.
That little small parking lot right beside the building on the other side.
So, okay, yes, sir.
Small curiosity question.
Okay.
Were there towpaths alongside the aqueduct? If so,
Oh,
was the width of the towpaths included in that 17 feet you mentioned?
no, the 17 feet is just the waterway. But because the canal traffic was one way, there was no need for teams to pass each other. So the towpath, the shelf that they built for the towpath was only 6 feet, if I remember correctly. And that would have been the south wall of the aqueduct. The north wall was 4 feet. So, you know, do the math, 27 feet or whatever would be the total width. Another thing to remember is that at that time, you see the mule teams now, always side by side. They're hitched side by side. When the canal first opened, they usually used horses, and they were hitched in tandem, so they were one behind the other. So you know they could get away with a much narrower towpath than when they eventually rebuilt the aqueduct. The new one was much wider, so for the mules. So, yes, ma'am.
Aqueduct's one way.
Yep.
What did they do? Change off every hour?
Yep, probably.
Oh, yeah.
Who had the toughest crew? Yeah, basically. Oh, I'm sure. While they were waiting. Oh my gosh, can you imagine? Yep. Okay. A change bridge. Yeah. Right. Okay. I think I've seen pictures of it. Yeah. Nice. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
One last curiosity question. If I saw correct, the representation that you put together as the first drawing
I spent a lot of time tracking that picture down. It was published as the frontispiece in one of the Rochester Historical Society publications back in the 20s or 30s. And I wanted the original. So I was able, by doing enough searching online, to find out where, oh gosh, I can't remember the artist's name, I'm sorry. But his collection is stored in a museum in Normandy. And so I wrote them an email, and they very kindly, I was shocked, like just a few days later they got right back to me. And we were both using Google Translate. You know, I was writing and they were translating it into French, and they'd write me in French and I'd translate it into English, and they were very kind. They let me use the picture at no charge, and they were just wonderful. And I'm glad I did, because you saw a crease down the middle of that picture. The way it's always been reproduced here was just the right side. So, and the left side shows the mill. And I didn't show you earlier, but if you look carefully in the background, you can see the Upper Falls. So it might be the only contemporary drawing that we have of the Upper Falls. So it's pretty priceless. So, yeah, they were wonderful. So, okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was absolutely incredible. If you want to see his work, you can check out his website. So it's 40x4x28.com to see his amazing illustrations. And there is one at the very back as well, if you'd like to check that out on your way out. So thank you once again so much, Mr. Boerner, for this amazing presentation.